British Pavilion, all about homes, as I can understand. So, what is the meaning of the project you organized for the Pavilion?
Aravana asked the participants at the Biennale to respond to the front line of British architecture, and in Britain we have a terrible housing crisis, but what we wanted to do is propose not just that this is an economic problem, that we don't have enough houses, but that the houses we are designing are not appropriate for how much our lives have changed over the last 10 years. And so what we have done is make 5 proposals for completely new models of life.
And how are these models corresponding to the modern contemporary life?
Well, the way we see life changing is really through time, whether that's day to day through people increasingly living in Airbnbs, month to month through the impossibility of home ownership for people of our generation and people renting more than ever being able to get on the housing ladder, year to year through the role of the home increasingly as a housing asset, as an asset for speculation, or even decade to decade as we all live longer and need places to live as we grow older that aren't necessarily an old people's home. So we've taken each of those time frames and asked a group of artists, architects and designers to work with us to develop new models for how we could occupy a home over those periods of time. What is a home for hours, a home for days, months, years and decades.
And which are the most important problems that an architect has to face nowadays?
Well, I think the architect needs to re-examine what exactly their role is and what their agency is, and how architectural thinking can be applied not only to the formation of materials to produce an object, which is a building, but also how architectural thinking can be more strategic, can be political, can be cultural, can be social, can engage with not only a kind of artistic endeavour but also a financial and cultural situation. So it's a case of expanding the role of the architect and therefore changing what it is that we do.
So by asking what is a home for example, years, the architects haven't stopped at drawing the plan. They've really looked at the mechanisms behind the way that we finance the home, the way we structure debt in society, and used an architect's way of thinking to redesign what a mortgage is. And in other cases, the teams that have been working on the rooms have looked at planning regulations around space standards, and also treated that as part of the architect's job to question the conditions and the constraints that we usually work within, and not to simply accept them as something that limits creativity, but see them as a field for creativity in their own right.
What do you deal with, for example, restorations or reusing some buildings, or what about old buildings, not only the new one?
This is the first exhibition about architecture ever to be curated through time spent in the home. And the reason that that becomes important is because when you begin to analyze space through time and how it can be reused or adapted through time, in fact, you begin to see value in things that perhaps didn't have value before. This is not primarily a cultural or a historical argument. This is about whether or not spaces can be adapted to accommodate modern life. And if that's possible, of course, the building would have value.
For example, the Georgian House type that is very popular in the UK at the moment, it's not used in the way that it was initially imagined when it was designed. It's useful because the rooms are very well proportioned, very well lit, and so now it's possible to have apartments or offices or various functions in the Georgian House or the terraced house, even though it's not used in exactly the way that it was imagined. So in this sense, the models that we're talking about in the pavilion don't respond to a particular type of house, but they respond more to a way that life is lived for this period of time.
And what about even the idea of using the home as a measure of living? Because mostly for example, at the Biennale, the architecture, all the projects are big projects. And we always are in the mood of thinking that home is small, but it is not like this.
No, absolutely. I mean, the home is extremely important. We all have one. It's all relatable to us. But more than that, it's important to recognize the significance that very minor or everyday or banal things can have. In fact, the placement of a door, the design of a room, the length of a kitchen, these things have incredible impact on how we live. They form us, and they also give us an impression of what, let's say, the traditional home might look like. But of course, all of these things are inventions. There is no such thing as the traditional home. Every generation must reinvent it for themselves, and what we're trying to do is reinvent that for a new generation.
And the kind of changes in the way that we live, for example, the way that smartphones are transforming the way that we use our beds, or the way that we communicate between our homes and the public sphere, and breaking down barriers between what's public and private, are having fundamental impacts not just on the design of the home, the design of the residential building, but on the city. So we see that even from a device that you can hold in your hand, there's all kinds of potential implications for the city, and they primarily play out through time, and that's been what's quite interesting about studying the home through time, and therefore its relationship with everything else.
And I think finally, just slightly to echo Jack's point, we're very keen in all of our practices. I teach, Jack is an architect, also writes, Finn is a planner. We're very keen that architecture in the built environment is a conversation that everybody can and should engage in. And certainly when you're talking about the home or the house, we feel that it's a field that is possible for everybody to engage in, because everybody has to live somewhere. And so we chose a kind of way of designing our exhibition that is not strictly for the architectural profession. It's not about plan drawings or models, it's about the ideas that anybody can inhabit.
Thank you.